so much for coming out tonight. This is part of our Bridging Writers Author Series. We are hosting this event in partnership with the Thayer Memorial Library. Thank you, library. And this is hosted by the Seven Bridge Writers Collaborative. We are a fairly new nonprofit organization who connects writers, and our goals are to help them not only to learn, but also to have opportunities to teach. We have been very fortunate that in 3 years we have exploded in terms of what we've been able to offer, and we've been thrilled that a lot of the local authors have been very generous with giving us their time. So if you do want to learn more about us, if you go to sevenbridgewriters.blogspot.com, you can find more information. But for tonight, John Bell, who is the author of The Road to Concord, has generously offered up his time to come and present, talk a little bit about his book, and about writing his book, and to answer questions that you might have. He is the associate editor of the Journal of American Revolution, as well as the assistant editor to Colonial Comics. So, and he also has sort of a varied background in how he ended up where he is now, and we'll let him tell you that. But if you could welcome him, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you to the Seven Bridge Writers Collaborative and Thayer Memorial Library and everyone who has come out tonight. I'm going to start by talking about some events that occurred in Lancaster in the fall of 1774. Now, according to the most recent census of that time, in 1765, Lancaster was home to 328 families. That comprised 1,999 people only. About half of those were under the age of 16. So a town of 1,000 adults. This is a photo of the house of John Sprague, a young attorney in the town at the time, and it gives a sense of life in central Massachusetts in the 1770s. And on September 5th, 1774, the Lancaster town meeting decided to raise £50 to buy ammunition with to be a town stock. 2 weeks later, it decided to buy one field piece for the use of the town. Now, field piece was the period term for a cannon. Specifically, a cannon meant mounted on a carriage for use on a battlefield, as opposed to on a ship or in a fortification. And on September 28th, the town decided to buy 2 field pieces instead of 1. Now, when a Yankee town meeting decides to spend money, you know that they're serious. And when they're spending their money on the most advanced infantry or army weapons of the time, cannon, you know they are deadly serious. So what was going on that September? Why would a town of 2,000 people, hundreds of miles inside the British Empire, there were no native or Indian people nearby, there were no French on the continent anymore, why did it feel the need to beef up its military? Well, let's go back and look at Massachusetts' Constitution. Starting in 1692, with what was called the Glorious Revolution in Britain, the government in London, guided by Parliament, appointed the Massachusetts governor. Most of the other colonies in America had operated the same way. So the government, as a result, the Massachusetts government was a combination of top-down and bottom-up authority. Or when I say bottom-up, it might be better to say middle-up, because it was really, of course, the white men of property who exercised the political franchise. The top-down powers exercised by the Crown included appointing the governor and lieutenant governor. The royal governor, in turn, appointed many local officials, such as judges and sheriffs and justices of the peace, and usually those appointments were for life. The Crown controlled the military, and the Crown controlled the customs service. On the other hand, the bottom-up powers coming from the town meetings, well, they elected their townspeople elected their selectmen and other town officials for a year. They elected the representatives to the Massachusetts General Court, or the Assembly, the lower house of the legislature. And then each year's outgoing Assembly elected the upper house, the council. So ultimately, both the Assembly and the council, the entire Massachusetts General Court, got their authority bottom up, from the people. And unlike those lifetime appointments, the top-down, the bottom-up appointments were only for a year. And then there are lots of areas where there was overlap and conflict between the top-down and the bottom-up. For instance, just for one example, the governor could veto any bill that came out of the legislature. The Privy Council in London could veto any bill, and there was no way to override a bill. So the legislature could come up with this really radical law, and then the higher authorities could veto. One particular area of overlap that was very important in the society of the time was the militia. It was the local emergency military force. It was distinct from the army, the regular army that answered to the crown in London. And as such, the militia embodied the self-defense, the self-government of the people. Militia service was required for all white men between 16 and 60. In some ways, the militia was also a top-down authority because the governor was in charge. The governor was the commander-in-chief of the militia, and he could order people around. He could appoint the colonels. But really, the militia was mostly bottom-up because the way it worked in New England is that the militiamen themselves, their companies, decided who they wanted to be their sergeants, their lieutenants, their captains. Becoming a militia officer of some sort was a way to rise in society. It was a way to prove yourself to your neighbors and to become trusted and respected enough to get other appointments as a representative, as a town official, eventually maybe a justice of the peace, to become a respected gentleman. Most important as a bottom-up organization, the governor could order out the militia in an emergency to keep the peace, but that didn't mean the militia came out. In 1747, during what was called the Knowles riots in Boston, and in 1765, during the Stamp Act riots, the governor went to his council and said, "We've got to order out the militia." And the council sort of said, "You see all those men rioting out in the streets? That's the militia. If you send a drummer out to summon them, they're just going to break his drum and kick him home." After 1765, London tried to strengthen its control over Massachusetts as well as the other colonies in North America. In 1767, for instance, Parliament granted salaries to the top officials, which insulated them from local political pressure. Until then, the colony, Massachusetts, would be responsible for paying the salary of the governor, but it could also, if it didn't like the governor, could not get around to paying the salary for several months. Once the power of the purse was taken away from the local legislature, well, yes, they were paying less, but that meant they also had less leverage. The London government also beefed up the customs service. And after the Boston Tea Party of 1773, the imperial government really cracked down with the new coercive acts. The man in charge of implementing those harsh new laws sent from London was General Thomas Gage. He was the commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America. He had lived in America for decades. He had even married an American woman, and he felt that he understood America and could bring Massachusetts to heel. And King George appointed him as the royal governor in early 1774. Gage arrived in Massachusetts that spring. He brought a couple more army regiments to Boston to patrol the town and to keep the port closed to trade. He summoned the general court, the Massachusetts legislature, to Salem instead of Boston. This was all a way to try to punish Boston until it paid back the cost of all that tea that Bostonians had destroyed in the harbor. Parliament also at this time, in mid-1774, it tried to limit Massachusetts' bottom-up government formally with what was called the Massachusetts Government Act. It put on a whole lot of limits to how Massachusetts was used to governing itself. Town meetings, if those were the source of the bottom-up power and they were also the source of the trouble, well, the new law said you could only have one town meeting a year in the spring to elect your town officials unless you got prior permission from the governor. There were no more province-wide conventions or meetings anymore allowed. The Massachusetts Whigs had tried that in 1768, and it hadn't done much, but now they were totally outlawed. And that council that had been elected from the bottom in a two-step process, well, now that was all going to be appointed from the top, all those gentlemen, to advise the governor. They were going to be appointed by writs of mandamus. So in the sources we see that this new body is referred to as the Mandamus Council or the Newfangled Council. The Massachusetts Government Act arrived in August. Gage started immediately swearing in the new councilors in Salem, and the people of Massachusetts didn't like it. In their eyes, the Crown, with this new law, was encroaching on every area of popular government. So they responded with various sorts of resistance. The General Court, the legislature, had sent men to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In response, the governor dissolved the legislature. Well, the town meetings, you know how the town meetings, they weren't supposed to have any more meetings without the governor's permission? Well, the town meetings decided, we won't have new meetings. We'll just meet from adjournment from the last meeting. So it will just be the same meeting all along. And the law never said that. They couldn't do that. As I said, the new law said you can't have province-wide conventions. The law never said you can't have county-wide conventions, because Massachusetts had never had county-wide conventions anymore. Well, starting in the summer of 1774, they had county-wide conventions. Starting out in Berkshire County on the western end of the state in July 1774, even before the law arrived, and then moving east across the state. The first one that sort of counts in Worcester County here was on August 6th at Mary Stern's Tavern in Worcester. And Lancaster sent 8 men, which was the largest delegation from any one town. At the end of August, there was a Hampshire County convention covering the whole Connecticut River Valley. We know very little about the Berkshire and Hampshire County events, but in Worcester County, they were keeping notes. So we have very good records of what was going on there. And they made a formal protest against the Massachusetts Government Act. And then there was even more populist protest on the county court days, when the judges from Boston and the local magistrates were supposed to meet and go over all the criminal and civil cases that had built up over the past few months. Berkshire County Court was due to meet in Great Barrington on August 16th, and instead hundreds of unarmed militiamen, but coming in their companies with all their fellow privates and sergeants, lining up in their companies outside the courthouse and insisting that the judges not meet. Again, we don't have a lot of sources about this, but quite clearly it was successful because the judges agreed not to meet. And then the same thing happened in Springfield in Hampshire County on August 30th. The crowds, similar crowds, often in what is called regular order, i.e. in their militia companies, were intimidating some of the counselors who lived out in the central and western part of the colony into resigning. For instance, one of those men was Abijah Willard from Lancaster. He was a wealthy man. He was a hero of the last war against the French. In the middle of August 1774, he actually accepted his role on the council. He swore his oath in Salem. Then he took a business trip out to Connecticut, where people recognized him, grabbed him, and started to drag him off to jail. On August 25th, Abijah Willard signed a promise that he would not sit or act in said council, and do hereby ask forgiveness of all the honest, worthy gentlemen that I have offended. So suddenly he was no longer a counselor. That was happening all over Massachusetts whenever neighbors could get to these men. Meanwhile, in Salem, Gage was having trouble there. On August 25th, the town met to choose delegates for an Essex County convention. He tried to break up the meeting, he failed, and so he just gave up and decided he's going to move himself and the government staff back to Boston. And he also started to take more steps to quell this uprising, this nascent uprising that's just beginning out in the countryside. One of the places he focused on is this site in what is now Somerville, was then part of Charlestown, is the Powder House, where a converted windmill where the local militia and individuals and towns stored their gunpowder. It's up on a deserted hill. It's a stone building, so if it blew up, the roof would blow off into the sky and nobody would be around to get hurt. A general in the militia, somebody who had been appointed by the previous royal governor from the top, told Gage that a lot of the towns had removed their stock of gunpowder from this building, and the rest that was in there belonged to the province. Therefore, it was under Gage's authority as governor, as commander-in-chief of the militia. But there's a hint in this letter that if he didn't take control of it now, it might not be there when he wanted it. So the general ordered a mission on September 1st. Before dawn, 280 soldiers marched from Boston Common to the Long Wharf. They clambered into boats, The Navy sailors rowed those men up around Boston to the Mystic River. They landed on a dock at a Loyalist farm, and they marched overland to the Powder House. They arrived at the Powder House before dawn on September 1st, 1774. They waited until the twilight grew light enough, because you don't want to carry a lantern into a gunpowder storage house. And once it was ready, they went in and they took 250 half barrels of gunpowder that was inside and put it onto 8 wagons. 20 soldiers went furthermore into Cambridge. They met the sheriff of Middlesex County, and he turned over the county militia's 2 small artillery pieces, 2 small cannon. Some locals tried to stop them, but they couldn't get organized. The soldiers moved all that ordnance, all that war material to Castle William, a fortified island in the harbor that was under the control of the British Army. So now they had just taken away more of the militia's resources, gunpowder and cannon. This operation took fewer than 300 soldiers. It went smoothly. It met no significant resistance. It was over by midday. General Gage was really pleased with this. He felt so confident now that he actually issued an invitation to the towns to elect new representatives to a new general court. He was trying, now that he had the upper hand, to restart the regular way of Massachusetts governing itself. However, to the populace, this whole operation looked like a strike at their self-government. Just another branch of their regular constitution, the regular way they govern themselves, being encroached on by the London government. And furthermore, outside the immediate vicinity of what happened, there were rumors that were even worse than reality. In Hartford, people heard, at Cambridge, a high Tory had petitioned Gage for troops to protect him at his house, which Gage granted. A mob gathered and demanded of the militia general to renounce his Toryism, or whatever you may term it. But after a short parley, the troop fired, killed some outright, a large number wounded. And then by the time the alarm reached Longmeadow, Massachusetts, the story was that the ships in the harbor, the warships of Boston, and the army on the land side were firing upon the town. So it was like the town was demolished. And here's how a minister recorded the experience of a young Irish merchant named McNeil, who was traveling through Massachusetts on business and had reached the town of Shrewsbury that night. He went to bed without hearing anything, but about midnight, or perhaps 1 o'clock, he was suddenly waked up. Somebody violently rapping up the landlord, telling the doleful story that the powder was taken, 6 men killed, and all the people between there and Boston arming and marching down to the relief of their brethren at Boston. And within a quarter of an hour, he judges, 50 men were collected at the tavern, though now deep at night, equipping themselves and sending off posts every way to the neighboring towns. The men set off as fast as they were equipped. In the morning, Mr. McNeil rode forward and passed through the hole at the very time of the convulsion. He said he never saw such a scene before. All along were armed men, rushing forward, some on foot, some on horseback. At every house, women and children making cartridges, running bullets, making wallets, baking biscuit, crying and bemoaning, at the same time animating their husbands and sons to fight for their liberties, though not knowing whether they should ever see them again. All this in an activity corresponding with such emotions appeared all along the whole tract of 40 miles from Shrewsbury to Boston. Now that scene might sound familiar, even iconic. It's how American culture remembers the alarm during the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. And that was the subject of innumerable 19th century prints like this one. But remember, McNeil was describing his experience on September 2nd, 1774. He witnessed an armed uprising against the royal government of Massachusetts in central and eastern Massachusetts more than 7 months before the Revolutionary War officially began. Men in rural Massachusetts were gathering in their militia companies and marching towards Cambridge. Now here's how the radical Boston Gazette spun the story. The county of Middlesex took the alarm and on Thursday evening began to collect in large bodies with their arms, provisions, and ammunition, determining by some means to give a check to a power which so openly threatened their destruction and in such clandestine manner robbed them of the means of their defense. And the Boston merchant, John Andrews, wrote in a letter, they had an account at Marlborough of the powders being removed last Thursday night, yet they were down at Cambridge, which is 30 miles, by 8 o'clock Friday morning. with a troop of horse and another of foot. So overnight, you were getting hundreds of men coming out with their militia arms, in their militia companies, ready to fight. At 8 o'clock, there were about 3,000 under their regular leaders at Cambridge Common, and continually increasing. Again, under their regular leaders means their militia officers. As the crowd reached Cambridge, they learned the real situation. There had been no shooting, there had been no killing, there were not 6 men dead, Boston was not in flames, but they were kept coming anyway to make a point. And to, like the counties to the west, they decided, okay, let us make sure that there are no counselors, no gentlemen who had been appointed to the council in the area we now control. They advanced into Cambridge to the Boston Gazette armed only with sticks, as they had left their firearms, etc., at some distance behind them at a tavern. They sent for the counselors who lived in Cambridge and asked them to meet them, asked those gentlemen to meet them on the common. The Cambridge Committee of Correspondence, the leaders of the organized resistance of the town, were worried about violence. They were worried about possible violence against their neighbors, against their property. They were worried about possible retaliation from Boston, where all these troops were under General Gage. So they sat down with the leaders of the new arrivals and with the 2 counselors in town, and they worked out a deal where the counselors resigned in writing, and then they went out to the common to read the same resignations to the crowd. And the Cambridge Committee also sent for help from the patriots in Boston. Dr. Joseph Warren, who was one of those patriots, later reported to Samuel Adams, who was in Philadelphia, a billet was brought requesting me to take some step in order to prevent the people from coming to immediate acts of violence, as incredible numbers were in arms and lined the roads from Sudbury to Cambridge. So half a dozen Boston activists of the people who had been leading the resistance for up to 10 years set out across the ferry to get to Cambridge. On our way, said Dr. Warren, we met the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Oliver. He had made a deal with the leaders of the crowd out in Cambridge. He would go into Boston and convince General Gage not to use force against this gathering, and then come back out. And the people out in Cambridge, the men there, they promised they would be peaceful. Warren said, we thought his precaution good, and proceeded to Cambridge. Now, all these upper-class men were trying to calm down the rural farmers who were crowding into Cambridge, not rile them up. This is very ironic because the Boston Whigs had spent years trying to get the rest of the colony excited about things like, oh, the Tea Act. And now they were trying to get those people unexcited. By the time the Boston Whigs arrived, the councilors were resigning. But the Bostonians went up to the front and tried to take charge. One of them, they started to treat this gathering like a town meeting. According to the Boston Gazette, a vote was called for to see if the body was satisfied with the declarations and resignations, and passed in the affirmative, nem com, which is Latin for without dissent. It was then moved to know whether the body, the people gathered there, would signify their abhorrence of mobs, riots, and the destruction of private property. And that passed in the affirmative, nem com. So like 4,000 men carrying sticks. Oh yeah, we are totally against political violence. The committees then sat down with the leaders of the militia and the crowd, and they decided that the sheriff who turned over the cannon, well, he had just been following orders, so he couldn't be blamed too much, but he had to apologize for sending out jury summonses under the Massachusetts Government Act. The court clerk had to resign. And then Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver arrived back, and the leaders looked at him and said, well, why don't you resign too? And he said, that wasn't the deal we had. We made a deal this morning. I was going to come back. And they went about this for half an hour or so, and finally he agreed that if it became clear that the entire colony, all of Maine and all of Massachusetts and Maine, wanted him to resign, then he might resign. But, the 4,000 men out on Cambridge Common right now, they were only representing 1 or 2 colonies, he said, so they didn't really, And he went back to his house. Now, according to the Boston Gazette, this seemed satisfactory to the committee, and they were preparing to deliver it to the body, to all the people. But then something happened to inflame those men out on Cambridge Common. 3 customs commissioners rode by coincidence, on their way from Salem to Boston. These were the men who were at the top of the Department of Government that had been collecting all the taxes for the past 7 years. these were the least popular people in British government in Massachusetts. And the very least popular one of them was riding by in his carriage. And Isaiah Thomas, young printer of the Massachusetts Spy, which at one point moved out here to Lancaster, he pointed out the least popular commissioner riding by. And according to that commissioner, no insult or affront was offered to me until I came to where some people from Boston stood, who called out to me, "Damn you, how do you like us now, you Tory son of a bitch?" The sight of that obnoxious person, said the Boston Gazette, so inflamed the people that in a few moments above 160 horsemen were drawn up and proceeding up after him at the full gallop. Some of the committee men, those gentlemen who were trying to calm down all the crowd, well, they went chasing after these horses and got them, most of them, to calm down. But a few of the men continued to chase the commissioner. They chased him across the bridge from Cambridge, through Roxbury, all the way to the gates of Boston, which was guarded by British troops. So he was safe behind the British lines. And meanwhile, back on Cambridge Common, there was a rumor that now the commissioner was going to get the governor to send troops out here. So they were all worried that they were going to go to war. And so the crowd sent light horsemen, according to the Gazette, to scout the roads. They were already using military terms for this, light horsemen. And some of the men started to go back and get their guns where they had left them at the taverns. The riders eventually came back with news that there were no troops coming, but this crowd was now all riled up, and so they went out to confront Lieutenant Governor Oliver. They replaced their leaders from that morning with new men who were more militant. They marched out to Governor Oliver's house in the afternoon and caught him just as he, no fool, was preparing to return into Boston in his carriage. Hundreds of men surrounded his house. Now some of them were armed. They were once again massing in their militia companies. He refused to cooperate. They became closer to the house. Soon they were peering in through the open windows on this summer day. He was hearing his wife and small daughters and household servants crying in the house. The leaders were pleading with him just to sign the resignation that they had. And finally, he took the paper and signed, "My house at Cambridge being surrounded by about 4,000 people. In compliance with their command, I sign my name, Thomas Oliver." Meanwhile, in Boston, there was a new rumor spreading. Again, Boston merchant John Andrews, 4 or 5 expresses had come down to Charlestown here to acquaint us that between Sudbury and this, above 10,000 men are in arms and continually coming down from the country back. That their determination is to collect about 40 or 50,000 by night, which they are sure of accomplishing, which they intend to fling in about 15,000 by way of the neck, and another many more over the ferry, once they got possession, to come in like locusts and rid the town of every soldier. So now Boston was worried that the war was going to start in town. Only one force was strong enough to disperse that crowd out in Cambridge: the weather. In Deacon John Tudor's diary, at 5 p.m. came on hard thunder and lightning with a great shower. And so everybody went home. But that confrontation on September 2nd made clear that this conflict in Massachusetts wasn't just a matter of riotous Bostonians anymore. Gage told his boss, Secretary of State Lord Dartmouth, on September 2nd, "Though I saw things were bad when I wrote from Salem, I found them much worse than I expected when I arrived here at Boston. Though the people are not held in high estimation by the troops, yet they are numerous, worked up to a fury. They are not a Boston rabble, but the freeholders and farmers of the country," which was 95% of the people of Massachusetts. For years, royal appointees had believed that a small faction of Boston malcontents was riling up the whole province, and if they could just cut off the influence of those few people, everything would be calm again. Now they realized that the people of Massachusetts were angry, most of them. In fact, the rural populace was becoming more radical, more militant, more violent than the Boston leaders. And they were no longer necessarily respecting the traditional authority of royal appointees or of the rich and wealthy and older men of their communities. The authority of the royal government now stopped at the gates of Boston. General Gage had troops in Boston and at Castle William. He had no power to compel obedience anywhere else in Massachusetts. And in fact, in all of New England, there were very few places that were inclined to respect his authority. The rural population had adopted the idea that it was absolutely necessary to resist the Massachusetts Government Act, and they were, when they massed in their militia companies at the court closings, outside councilors' homes during that confrontation in Cambridge, they were doing what the militia was supposed to do, which was to gather in force at an emergency, except that they were seeing their emergency coming from the royal government, not from outside. And in fact, rural militias were still mobilizing in New England 3-4 days after the powder alarm, because as that terrible rumor about Boston being destroyed spread out, it took a few more hours before the truth followed, and during that time, more towns would gather their militiamen and start to march before they got the news. Dr. Warren said to Samuel Adams, the people from Hampshire County crowded this county of Worcester with armed men, and both counties received the account of the quiet disposition of the people of Middlesex with apparent regret, grudging them the glory of having done something important for their country without their assistance. In Pomfret, Connecticut, Israel Putnam heard about the Royal Artillery shelling Boston about 11 a.m. on Saturday, and he sent off letters to all his counterparts in that colony's militia. Handbills repeating Putnam's warning arrived in New Haven on Sunday. By Monday, September 5th, word of the trouble had reached New York, and the commander of British troops there wrote to General Gage asking if he needed help. And on Tuesday, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia received their first intimation of the bombardment of Boston, as John Adams wrote. So the news was spreading and putting this entire part of the North American colonies on military alert, at least for a while. Probably 20,000 New England militiamen mobilized, however briefly, during that time. So Gage suddenly had to figure out what to do now. He canceled the elections. Now, not everybody followed that, but I'll get back to it. And he also started by increasing the defenses of Boston. He stationed the Royal Navy around, more warships around the town. He stationed cannon on the neck, that narrow bit of land pointing out at the rural countryside. He was defending himself against the people he was supposed to govern. On September 4th, he summoned the 10th and 52nd Regiment from Quebec. On September 5th, he summoned all the troops that he had under his command in New York. Everybody, he was bringing every soldier he could command into Boston. Also on September 5th, out here in Lancaster, the Lancaster town meeting decided to buy more gunpowder, and now we see why. There was supposed to be a Worcester County court session on September 6th. Well, that didn't happen. The Worcester County Convention had requested the judges not to meet, and the militia companies of the county turned out, once again, to support that request. Once again, we had hundreds, and in this case, thousands of men, 4,722 at least, as counted by one minister, making sure that the justice of the peace and the magistrates would not meet. They lined Main Street and demanded that every royal appointee promise aloud not to act under the new laws. At one point, the organizers in Worcester had feared that troops would come out and try to interfere with their interference of the courts, but the fact that the court closing went so smoothly confirmed that General Gage simply did not have enough force. He did not have enough troops to command, to make anybody, but to put down that sort of rural uprising. Now I should note that the list of towns with companies, with militia companies at that court session on September 6th in Worcester does not include Lancaster, and I'm not sure why. That's a mystery. But it's quite clear that the town was already undertaking military preparations. It was already preparing to defend itself against the royal forces. So it wasn't that it was not involved in this movement. Now, to General Gage, those sorts of preparations looked like a threat. So from his little refuge in Boston, he warned Lord Dartmouth on September 12th, "The country people are exercising in arms in this province, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and getting magazines of arms and ammunitions in the country, and such artillery as they can procure, good and bad." Now, by artillery, Gage, of course, meant cannon. Massachusetts' militia company had a few small cannon that they trained on. Gage's soldiers had taken two from the Middlesex County militia on September 1st, but most of the cannon in Massachusetts were along the coast. They were in Boston in batteries that guarded the harbors, Boston Harbor and other towns, or they belonged to merchants who needed to arm their ships during wartime. North of Boston was Charlestown. Its battery contained 5 cannon. They were said to be 18-pounders, meaning that they could fire a ball that weighed 18 pounds. That's how you gauged cannon at the time. By September 7th, locals had hauled all those cannon away. They were reportedly hidden in town on Schoolhouse Hill under what an 1845 historian termed stable dirt. People in Dorchester, south of Boston, followed the same example. On September 12th, Samuel Pierce of Dorchester recorded in his diary, "The great gun was removed from Preston's Point at the mouth of the Neponset River." Boston itself had these 2 batteries on the north and south ends of the central harbor. In 1770, those fortifications contained 22 cannon between them. The Royal Artillery, the part of the army, was already using the south battery, but the north battery was still stocked by local militia company. So Gage and his admirals decided that that was too dangerous. So on Wednesday, September 14th, sailors from the Royal Navy entered the North Battery from the water and spiked all the guns inside, rendering them useless. In addition, the Boston Post-Boy reported that the cannon on the batteries back of Governor's Island in Boston Harbor were removed by the governor's order. So Gage was making sure that there were no cannon that the locals could use to shoot out at the ships of the Royal Navy, to make sure that he and the Royal Navy controlled Boston Harbor. Those kept the shipping free for the army, for the crown. But that wasn't all that happened that night. Boston also had 2 small gun houses, or armories, near the center of town. This is a builder's sketch of one of them. It is about the size of a 2-car garage, I estimate. And each gun house had 2 small cannon on carriages made for battlefield use. These guns were used by the town's militia artillery company called the Train. The man in charge of that company leaned toward the crown, but the other officers, mostly enlisted men, were patriots. So there was already conflict within the organization. They had, in fact, had a big argument in the first week of September and broken up, and were no longer, the officers and men were no longer taking orders from their commander. Gage didn't want to lose control of the Train's 4 field pieces, so he ordered a double guard to the new and old gun houses. But on the morning of September 15th, that's the day after all that shenanigans with the island and the harbor and the North Battery, the troops found that there was an opening in the side of the old gun house, and the 2 small brass cannon inside were missing. Naturally, Gage put an even stronger guard in front of the new gun house, which already seemed quite secure because it was right beside the Boston Common, which is where the 4th Regiment of His Majesty's Army was camped. And the commander of the Train, who was a loyalist, he had the only key. But even that didn't seem secure enough to Gage, so on Friday, September 16th, Royal Artillery officers asked the loyalist for the key to that gun house. They brought a squad to it to take the cannon away. They opened it up, and when they got there, the guns were gone. All 4 of the Boston Train's cannon had disappeared in 1 week. And there were other conflicts over cannon inside Boston in September 1774. On the 20th, a boat carrying iron cannon out of Boston ran aground in the Charles River, and the Royal Navy seized those weapons. At the end of the month, there was a big confrontation over a hardware store stock, and the poor merchant, Joseph Scott, he had to leave town because people thought he had been too cooperative with the army. That night, Dr. Joseph Warren went to General Gage to complain. What is the meaning that the general buys military stores? If you are so peaceful, why are you buying weapons? And General Gage responded, the country people were all armed and collecting cannon and military stores from all quarters, which could indicate nothing but their intention of attacking His Majesty's forces in that town. It is notorious that many cannon have been conveyed from thence, and arms carried out openly by every man that goes out of Boston without molestation. General Gage tried to alert his superiors in London about this dangerous situation. On September 25th, he wrote to the Secretary of War, Viscount Barrington, The New England colonies, except part of New Hampshire, are, I may say, in arms. And the question is not whether you shall quell disturbances in Boston, but whether those provinces shall be conquered. From appearances, no people are more determined for a civil war. The whole country from hence to New York, armed, trading, and providing military stores. But General Gage never told his superiors how Bostonians had managed to sneak those 4 brass cannon out from under his own nose. That probably wouldn't have helped his standing in London if he had told them. As it worked out, the ministers in London thought he was overreacting, so they lost faith in him anyway. So maybe the secrecy didn't help. But in any case, he was therefore carrying around this secret, I think. The people of Massachusetts went ahead with those elections that the governor had called off. They elected a Massachusetts General Court in October, met in Salem. When General Gage didn't come and recognize them, they decided, okay, we are now the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. This was, they then adjourned to Concord, beyond General Gage's reach, in order to meet and basically form a government of all of Massachusetts except for Boston itself. This was explicitly forbidden by the Massachusetts Government Act, but now they were in open rebellion. And in fact, more towns participated in that extra legal government, the provincial congress, than participated in a typical general court. So it actually had more bottom-up authority than the usual government. Soon that Congress was assuming the powers of government, of taxation, of military preparation. It reorganized the militia, it purged loyalist officers, it started to step up military training, and on October 25th, a Congress committee drew up a military budget that called for 20 field pieces and 4 mortars. They formed committees which started to collect cannon and mortars from the countryside, and this was a major step towards war. This was a forming of an army for Massachusetts with cannon. At the same time, we should recognize that the Provincial Congress and its Committee of Safety and Supplies was doing this 2 months after the people had started doing it themselves. So again, the upper crust of society, the leaders, were actually catching up with the ordinary people. In December, this, what I'm calling an arms race, moved outside of Massachusetts. The Rhode Island Assembly voted to remove almost all the guns from Fort George off Newport. 5 days later, the people of New London, Connecticut moved their cannon into the country. People started to wonder about New Hampshire, where Fort William and Mary guarded Portsmouth Harbor with cannon. Bostonians saw some signs that General Gage was going to send a ship up to New Hampshire. So Paul Revere rode 60 miles on icy roads that December to warn the New Hampshire patriots. Militiamen stormed Fort William and Mary, overwhelming the captain and the 6 soldiers inside, seized most of the gunpowder in the storehouse. And then 2 days later, after everybody had taken a deep breath, the New Hampshire political leaders, their Continental Congress delegates, led the crowd back to the fort to take away all the cannon and the ordnance. Also in December, Lancaster must have received the 2 cannons it had ordered back in September, because at a meeting they authorized a further expenditure to buy a 500 weight of ball suitable for the field pieces. So they were now going to be arming themselves. General Gage realized that the Crown had lost control of almost all of New England. The other governors were powerless or on the Patriots' side. The London government wasn't going to send him any help. But to his credit, General Gage didn't give up. He started an effort to infiltrate the Patriot movement in Massachusetts. On February 21st, the Committee of Safety and Supplies met in Charlestown and decided they had enough cannon to start organizing artillery companies in their army. And on that same February 21st, according to documents in General Gage's files, he suddenly got a lot more information about the Patriots military. In fact, he had the same information. There are in the country 38 field pieces and 19 companies of artillery. General Gage had made a deal for information about cannon with a new committee member, Dr. Benjamin Church, Jr. of Boston. We don't have an authentic picture of Church, so I'm showing a bit of ciphered letter that was intercepted later in 1775. But Church was nearly at the highest level of the Whig movement. If Benedict Arnold hadn't come along, we would be using the name Benjamin Church as our synonym for a traitor. And thanks to Church, Gage knew where most of the provincial Congress's weapons were. They were in Worcester, a few were in Watertown, a few at Concord, and some in Salem, including pieces of brass cannon, like Boston's brass cannon, perhaps. So the general made new plans. Back in early January, he had recruited Army officers capable of taking sketches of the country. Captain William Brown of the 52nd Regiment and Ensign Henry de Bernier of the 10th responded, and on the 22nd, the day after he had received his intelligence from Dr. Church, the general wrote out instructions for these two officers to hike out into the country in civilian clothes and scout around, looking for signs of cannon, looking for mapping the route out so that a march could go out there later. The two officers left Boston on February 23rd with an enlisted man as a servant. By midday, they had gotten as far as Watertown. And while they had their midday dinner at a tavern there, a black woman who was serving them came over and told Brown de Bernier that she recognized them as officers from the army. So their cover was blown. But they understood that their orders were it was absolutely necessary to push on to Worcester, so they continued west. Meanwhile, General Gage had received more information from Dr. Church. There are 8 field pieces in an old store or bar near the landing place at Salem. As they are to be removed in a few days, the seizure of them would greatly disconcert their schemes. Perhaps those were the guns from Boston's gun houses, because they were said to be brass cannon, and Gage had to act quickly. Gage ordered an expedition up to Essex County. Late on Saturday, February 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie and 240 men sailed from Castle William in Boston Harbor. They embarked at Marblehead early on Sunday morning. The soldiers stayed below decks until everybody, all the good church people of Marblehead, went into their meeting houses. Then they came up and started to march through town as quickly as they could towards Salem. Now, in fact, in Salem, there was a man named David Mason who was working for the Committee of Safety, gathering cannon. We know that. We have his records. We know exactly what cannon he had, and he had them stored, about 12.5 old iron cannon at a smithy at his shop in the north part of town across the North River. Mason got word that the soldiers were on their way, so he left his meeting house, raced to the blacksmith shop. Doing so, he had to cross a drawbridge over a river, so he pulled up the drawbridge after it. And Lieutenant Colonel Leslie and his men arrived, guided by local loyalists, and they could see the smithy they were supposed to reach and search, but they couldn't get across the river because the bridge was up. And so there was yelling, there was shoving, militia companies were gathering in the nearby towns. The soldiers tried to commandeer some boats in the river, but the men who owned those boats jumped into the river and started pounding on their bottoms with hatchets so they would be scuttled and they would be useless. There was even a little pinprick of blood from a bayonet. So Salem therefore claims that it was where the first blood of the American Revolution was shed. After nearly 90 minutes with the sun going down, the minister of a nearby Anglican church negotiated a compromise. Mason, by this point, and his friends had moved all their cannon away, so they were willing to let down the bridge as long as Colonel Leslie, pledged that he would simply march across the bridge, not 30 rods beyond it, and then immediately return. So he would obey his orders to the letter, go to the smithy, look around, come back. And that's what happened. As the regiment marched back to their ship in Marblehead, the nearby companies of militia watched from a distance. It was nearly another place where there could have been a war started. On March 3rd, the local Essex Gazette reported 27 pieces of cannon were removed from this town in order to be out of the way of robbers. Meanwhile, Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier were out in west central Massachusetts sketching their maps. But when news of what had happened in Salem got to Worcester, their innkeeper came and told them that they knew he was pretty certain that they were officers of the army and they were no longer welcome. So they started to move back east the next morning. On their way out, a man came and rode beside them, leader of the militia. They spent a night in Marlborough, but patriots came and roused them out there. So eventually they had to hike all the way back to Boston through a snowstorm. Now, around this time, General Gage also developed another intelligence source out in the Massachusetts countryside. Somebody who lived in Concord and communicated by letter, and we still have his letters, or her letters. This person wrote in terrible French, probably in a way to disguise communication, because not many people read French. But it's French that's like a word-for-word translation of English. It's not idiomatic. Among other things, on March 8th, this spy out in Concord wrote, "There are 4 brass cannon and 2 cohorns or mortars, so called by the peasantry, concealed at Mr. B, lately chosen or appointed minute company, supposed to be deposited in his cellar." Well, those 4 brass cannon were the guns from Boston. The Patriots had smuggled them out of town, hidden them for a while in a tavern in Dorchester, then moved them out to Concord. Gage's spy reported on other iron cannon out at the Concord courthouse, and then more were arriving from another town, probably the cannon from Salem. The man in charge of those guns, Mr. B, lately chose or appointed minute colonel, was James Barrett, a 65-year-old farmer and provincial Congress delegate. This is his house. And he kept an account of the military stores he was collecting in Concord for the provincial Congress, and his account exactly matches what the spies said. 4 brass cannon, 10 iron cannon, 2 mortars. He also had other neighbors storing musket cartridges, musket balls, flint, gunpowder, entrenching tools, medical chests, tents, tent poles, dishes, spoons, and 4 barrels of oatmeal containing 20 bushels. Gage ordered Brown and Tavernier, his spies, to hike back out into the countryside. They went out to Concord in disguise on March 20th. They confirmed that there were 10 iron cannon kept in a house in town. Their brass cannon they had concealed in some place behind the town in a wood. On April 14th, General Gage received new orders from London, written in January. Lord Dartmouth now didn't merely authorize him to take military action against the rebellion, he told the general that he had to act. The orders specified that the first and essential step would be to arrest the principal aiders and abettors in the provincial Congress. But Gage didn't arrest anyone. He wasn't tracking John Hancock or Samuel Adams or any other patriots. He was tracking those brass cannon from Boston. And so he was focused on Barrett's farm. Seizing those cannon would require a march deep into hostile territory, 17 miles to Concord, then another 2 miles past the North Bridge out to the farm. But that mission, if it succeeded, it would raise the embarrassment of having let those cannon be stolen from him in the first place. So this is part of my theory behind this book, is that the whole operation, the whole march out to Concord, was simply a cover-your-ass operation, where he was trying to catch up to a problem he had already caused. General Gage drafted orders for Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, the leader of that operation, and the top item he wanted the regulars to look for was 4 brass cannon and 2 mortars or cohorns in the cellar or outhouses of Mr. Barrett, a little the other side of the bridge. Already, however, the Barretts were moving supplies into the neighboring towns. Barrett's grandson, James, 14 years old, recalled how he and other boys with oxen and cart removed the stores deposited at the house of his grandfather into the woods and concealed them a cartload at a time under pine boughs. In 1848, he recalled how the lads would march on either side of the oxen and goad them into a trot. So if you were outside in western Concord at the time, you would be seeing these wagons with these oxen trotting along and the boys jabbing at the oxen. On April 18th, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety was busy making new plans to store its supplies, to move all those supplies out of Concord, and Lancaster was one of the towns where they were supposed to deposit powder, iron cannon, and other stuff. But General Gage was about to move. He took steps to stop the Patriots from sending out alarm messengers. He had mounted patrols right out on the day of April 18th, out to the road, along the roads between Charlestown and Concord to make sure that no Patriot messengers got through. But ironically, if you see a bunch of British military officers riding to your town, you start to think there's something up. So in fact, those officers alerted people, and in Lexington, the militiamen went on alert, and the officers started to gather their men. After sunset on April 18th, about 800 British soldiers rode quietly across the Charles River. This is twice as many as went out to Charlestown in September, twice as many as went to Salem in February. But those men were too late to catch Massachusetts' stolen cannon. And on the road to Concord, those soldiers would come across the Lexington Militia Company all on alert, and there would be shooting, and this time some of those shots would be fatal, and by the end of the afternoon, the Massachusetts militia companies were converging on Boston again. Again, tens of thousands of armed men turning out to preserve what they saw as their traditional rights, and that was when the war really began. And that was why I say 4 stolen cannon from Boston was what ignited the Revolutionary War. Thank you. I'll just say that of the 4 brass cannon, 2 of them actually survive. In the 1780s, Secretary of War Henry Knox sent them back to Massachusetts, and they were engraved with the names Adams and Hancock and a little bit of their story. So it was impossible to lose them after that point. They were unique. And the Hancock is now on display at the Concord Visitor Center of Minuteman National Historical Park. And the Adams, well, that's good to know. The Adams was recently restored and put on display at the bottom of the Bunker Hill Monument. For decades, it was at the top of the Bunker Hill Monument, which is not climate controlled, but frankly, thanks to my book, they realized that it was a significant artifact, and they are now keeping better care of it down in our air-conditioned splendor down in the lodge. So please, if you are interested in this story, I'll be happy to take more questions. I'll be happy to show you my book, and I urge you to go to these historic sites and visit these cannon. Thank you.